Thank you very much. I'm hoping that you are in fact hearing me. And I just want to begin by saying, boy, I really appreciate the invitation to give this keynote address. I want to thank very much all the organizers, including, of course, the IDB, who have provided the funding for the entire PPCR project, the PPCR project teams, all the collaborators across the PPCR region. Thank everybody who has joined in to this opening ceremony of this conference, two-day conference. Let me also start by giving an apology. My simple apology is, how can one be asked to follow such an inspiring and beautiful video? I think it is really a challenging and difficult task. But with those apologies, let me try to do what has been asked of me, which is to set a little bit of a context. We have heard a lot, and certainly based on what we have heard, I don't think there's anything new that I will bring to the table in this setting of this context. But I do want to set a context. I want us to have a quick conversation about climate change and the Caribbean. And I want to do it at the title, Taking Account of Climate. What do I mean? Well, one of the things you will have to admit that you have heard so far is that climate change represents this grave threat to the survival and viability of small island states. And we have known this for quite a while. And so if the Caribbean is to survive and if the Caribbean is to remain viable, then certainly the Caribbean has to take account of climate change. What do I mean when I talk about taking account of climate change? Well, that's what I want to talk about in this very, very quick context setting. I want to talk about what I call the 2-3-1 of climate change. Hope you'll forgive me. Very simple, really only saying what has been said before. But let's have a little conversation about what I'm calling the 2-3-1 of climate change. What do I mean? I mean this. When we are beginning to take account of climate change in the Caribbean, I think what we have to do is note that there are two things that we need to note, three things that we need to consider, and then one thing to do. So in talking about this 2-3-1 of climate change, in an effort to say, let's take account of climate change, there are two things we have to note, three things we have to consider, and one thing to do. In this talk, very quickly, very simply, I want to tell you, what are these two things that we need to note? What are these three things that we need to consider? And then what is that one thing that we need to do? So let me start quickly with the two things we need to note. The first thing I think we have to note as we begin to take account of our climate change is this. Simply this, a new and unfamiliar climate regime is emerging in the Caribbean. So you heard that I'm a scientist, and so I draw on the science to try to make this point. When I look on the science of climate change that has emerged, say, over the last 2 decades, and the Caribbean has come a long way in putting its own science on the table, it tells us a couple of things, but nothing that you don't know intuitively. It tells us, of course, that the Caribbean is becoming a much hotter place. And yes, we have seen in the Caribbean the 1 degree increase in Caribbean temperatures in the last century, much like what the globe has seen. But it also tells us that irrespective of where you look in the Caribbean, where you go right across the Caribbean, that 1 degree increase in temperatures is translated in two ways. One, very hot days, and you can see in the graph on the right that the number of days that are really, really, really hot has just steadily increased. But it has also translated into very, very hot nights. I keep saying this when I speak. You know, in the Caribbean, we are kind of used to hot days. But what we're really not so used to is hot nights, because we can deal with hot days by going to our various respective places if we have it. But in the night, we expect that it's going to cool down, and that after a certain point in the night, we will get cooler temperatures. But lo and behold, the science is telling us that in the last 50 or 60 years, we see 23 more hot days and nights than we used to see in 1950. Or put another way, summer seems to be starting earlier, reaching its peak, and then lasting longer. So the science is telling us that, yes, it's not a figment of your imagination, the Caribbean is hotter. But the science is also telling us that that's not the only change we are seeing. It's telling us, yes, it's hotter, but our rainfall has become way more variable. And so if I pull on the science, you will see that for total rainfall if I look on that right diagram again, it seems flat, but what immediately stands out for you is that 1 year it is very wet, the next year it is very dry. And we get these swings in rainfall. And so we get this intense variability to our rainfall pattern. And that's one of the things the scientists telling us about how our climate is changing. But it's not only the swings in the total rainfall, but we see that the nature of how rain falls is changing. We're beginning to see patterns emerging. Certainly things like, we get several days where it is dry, and then when it rains, it really rains. So the science is telling us that part of what we are seeing is it's getting hotter, the rain is more variable. It's also telling us that we are seeing higher sea levels, and right across the Caribbean, irrespective of where you are, the sea levels are rising. And all of us can identify this by pointing to that one place in our country where we can say, I remember when that place used to be on the land. So you're pointing in the sea. And we have been seeing sea level rise in the long term of about 1.7 millimeters per year. And I'll come back to that. Or post 1993, almost double that. So we have been seeing higher sea levels. And then, of course, we have been seeing more extremes. You heard about it in its talks earlier. So we know that we have had, at least 2 major region-wide droughts in the last 11 years. And I pull on the work of Herrera and Alt here in the Caribbean, region-wide, multi-year. But we also know that we have seen more intense storms in the region. And we can all think of those Category 5 hurricanes over the last 3 years. Put it all together, the first thing we have to note when we are beginning to take account of climate change in the Caribbean is a simple thing. The Caribbean climate is not behaving as it used to. We must know that a new, unfamiliar climate regime is emerging in the Caribbean. And the science is telling us that. One of the things about this new unfamiliar climate regime is that it's not one or the other. We are living this new multi-hazard environment. So we can get the hot with the extremes, along with the variability and the sea level rise. If that is the first thing to note when we begin to take account of climate in the Caribbean, then the second thing to note is that the science tells us that it's not only that an unfamiliar regime has already emerged, but a new unprecedented climate regime is coming. So that's some of the climate science that I do. So we try to take climate models and we take all the scenarios of the future, and we don't know what the future will be. So we have to take multiple different storylines of the future. And we say, if we take those storylines and put them in the model, what will the Caribbean look like in the future? Well, here are some of the pictures that emerge if we do nothing as a world about climate change. For the Caribbean, even hotter times are ahead. And so you can see the top diagram is the worst case scenario. The bottom one is a kind of a better case scenario. But irrespective of scenario you take, even hotter times are ahead. How hot? Maybe 3 to 4 degrees by century's end. Up to maybe 98% of days being hot, by where hot is defined by current standards, only 2% being cool by the 2080s. That's what some of the science is saying. Okay, hotter. What about the rainfall? We never lose the variability that we're talking about. So we'll always have the 1 year being really wet, 1 year being really dry. But we now begin to vary about a reduced mean. So we have the variability, but maybe up to 40% drier. And this will be characterized by other things like shorter rainy seasons, longer, more severe droughts. And so this is the kind of future that we're beginning to look into. What about those sea levels? Well, even higher sea levels. And again, right across the Caribbean. I suggested millimeters per year of sea level rise already. Maybe things like up to a meter of sea level rise by century's end. And then what about those extremes? Well, the projections are, of course, for more intense hurricanes. And what you're looking on is, for example, the category 4 and 5 hurricane tracks in the present and in the future in a warmer climate. And the idea is not more hurricanes, but more intense hurricanes, storms with higher rainfall rates and stronger winds. And of course, the science also gives us some idea of the droughts. And so if we look at the percentage of time we'll be under either moderate, extreme, or severe drought, you can see that as we go into the future, greater percentage of our time, according to the science, will be spent under one of these these drought conditions. What am I trying to say? Again, put it together. I'm trying to say that the second thing we have to note is that where we are going is that we're coming to a possible climate regime as we have not seen before. So we're entering a climate regime that is marked by what we call the unprecedented. Because I've already made the case that already we've seen 1 degree, but to come if we do nothing is up to 4 degrees. Variable rainfall, but variable with 40% dry. More extremes, but more intense extremes. We talk 3.5 millimeters per year and up to 1 meter sea level rise. The idea is that the future Caribbean will look a lot different. And the kind of future climate we will have is a climate regime we have not lived through before. So as we begin to take account of climate, I am arguing you cannot take account of climate without noting these two things. There are two things to note. A new unfamiliar climate regime is already emerging. So we are living in the unfamiliar now. But you have to also take account of the fact, or take note of the fact, that an unprecedented climate era will come. And so the challenge for the Caribbean becomes living with the unfamiliar now while preparing for the unprecedented to come. You cannot take account of climate in the Caribbean without taking note of these two things. Okay, quickly, but I'm arguing, as we begin to take account of climate, there are two things to note, three things to consider. If these are the two things to note, that we are already living in an era, a climate regime now that is unfamiliar, and that there's an unprecedented climate era that is likely to emerge. If as a globe we do nothing about climate, then it almost throws up three things the Caribbean cannot but consider. What are these three things? First thing, our sensitivity is being exposed. We must consider that in the unfamiliar climate of the present, our sensitivity is being exposed. What on earth do I mean? I think you heard a picture being painted earlier of what the Caribbean is like. If you were, and I think it was something like this, if you were to try to create a Caribbean profile, it would look something like this. In many cases, either flat or low-lying or narrow coastal with mountainous backbones. And the point we're making is that in the Caribbean, the picture is we have limits about where living can occur. We're either living on a steep mountainside or we're living on a shallow or narrow coastal plain. But you also heard that we were small. So our land area is much smaller than our exclusive economic zone or our ocean area. And so large percentage of the populations live within a few kilometers of the coast. You also heard, of course, that we were isolated and exposed. We're in the tropics, clearly affected by the things of the tropics, and we have to deal with that, and we are dispersed as you heard. You heard that we're natural resource dependent. We have an intimate relationship with things like the oceans, rain-fed water systems, rain-fed agriculture, and of course, with the emerging use of RE resources, it makes us further natural resource dependent. And you would have heard, of course, that we live a tropical life. The truth is a Caribbean life is a daily life structure to take advantage of ambient conditions. We live an outdoor life. And the things that we depend on, therefore, depend on this outdoor life. So you think about tourism and you think about agriculture, etc., where we get our water. If that's the Caribbean profile, then in truth, the Caribbean profile is one of an extremely climate sensitive region. And what do I mean by that? Strong, intimate, and direct linkages between climate, existence, economies, standards of living, and way of life. You cannot separate climate from any of these, from our economies, what defines our standard of living, water, health, etc., and what defines our way of life. If we are to that kind of climate sensitivity, extreme climate sensitivity, therefore plays out in all aspects of Caribbean life. So it plays out in health and in agriculture, forestry, water, finance, wildlife, coastal areas. The climate sensitivity we have is embedded in our daily life and it's pervasive across all areas of our life. Here is what I'm trying to say. In the era of unfamiliar climate, that sensitivity is not only now becoming more obvious, but it's also being played upon to become more disruptive. And all I had to do was pull on some newspaper headlines across the region. The headlines now are not just about the flood, but notice that it's about how the flood affects health, or how it has damaged agriculture, or how the beach is succumbing, or how the water supply is failing, or the coral reefs, or the tourism, my favorite one, where the handcarts had to rescue the ship passengers in tourism. And you begin to see that that sensitivity, which was veiled in some parts, is now becoming obvious, and in an unfamiliar era is becoming disruptive. We must consider that in this unfamiliar era, that our sensitivity is becoming exposed. But quickly, it's not only that we have to consider that our sensitivity is becoming exposed, but we also have to, second thing we have to consider is that our vulnerability is being expanded. What do I mean? In this unfamiliar climate era, as more and more unfamiliarities emerge, and certainly as we go into the unprecedented, existing climate vulnerable groupings are expanding. So people who we knew who were vulnerable to climate are expanding, and new vulnerable groupings are emerging. I use this picture from my own country, and this represents a community, lovely beachfront community that was built. The people who built it, and at the time they built it, they were amongst the climate vulnerable in that they were close to the sea. They have now had to move out, and you can begin to see that more and more people are becoming climate vulnerable on the coastlines. Think about the fishing communities and that rely on the beaches and the lack of those, erosion of those beaches. And you can see what I mean by climate vulnerable groupings are expanding. But then think also of the future. And we thank the IDB for their wonderful tool. And what they have done is allow you to map, what if we had 4 degrees, as I suggested, in the future? What would happen to some of our Caribbean islands? You can recognize Barbados. And if you are from Barbados, you recognize the pieces that seem to be inundated and are missing. But you could also do it for Tobago using the tool. And you can also do it for Barbuda using the tool. And you begin to see that people who lived in certain places who were not previously vulnerable are becoming vulnerable. So our vulnerabilities are expanding. I want to push the point a little bit further. This is what we call suitability maps for ginger produced by SEAT. And the point being made here is that they use simply climate and said, well, if we just take climate conditions, where is it most suitable to plant ginger in Jamaica? And you can see the suitable areas are the green, and you can see that the suitable areas narrow and narrow. And so the ginger farmer who was in the green area that was close to the coast suddenly loses his possibility of having a ginger crop. But more importantly, the interior of Jamaica is our biodiverse rich area. And so suddenly the biodiverse rich area becomes vulnerable because of the threat of it becoming the area more suitable to do some of the agriculture. Or another way simply to put it is this. The Caribbean advocated for 1.5 degrees in the future as the global target. But the Caribbean climate science that says that even if we achieve 1.5 degrees, it's not a safe climate for the Caribbean. 40% less hydropower in Suriname, diminished agricultural productivity in Jamaica, regional cost damages 2 to 3 times higher, drought conditions, and the inundation of coastal infrastructure. You can begin to see that the more the climate changes and will change, our vulnerability is simply expanding. Let me end that point by just simply saying, and what we have to consider is that new climate vulnerable groupings will emerge. So the poor, the elderly, the children, people who are health challenged, outdoor workers who cannot survive the kind of consecutive hot days, our biodiversity, our heritage sites that were never built for the kind of climate, intense climate, the future generation. a new population of climate vulnerable will emerge. If we are to take account of climate, then we have to consider, secondly, that our vulnerability is being expanded. And then thirdly, quickly, as I quickly move to the end of this, if we are to take account of climate, the third consideration is this, that our viability is being endangered. I think that's where I started with that quote. But we already see this, and we already see it, that we are having a diminishing capacity to cope. We heralded 2017 as simply unprecedented when we had 3 Category 5 hurricanes passing through the Caribbean. We all remember the Irma, Maria, Jose. We said, boy, this is unprecedented, and we're going to take years to recover from this. But then in 2019, we had Dorian, and then we heralded Dorian as unprecedented in how it traversed the Caribbean. And then I think you heard earlier from Duarte about 2020 being unprecedented because of the number of hurricanes that we had. So every year we suddenly have an unprecedented event, 2017, 2019, 2020, and this is just looking at one climate phenomenon. Well, the problem with unprecedented climate is, of course, unprecedented impacts. And so when you look across the region, the result of having unprecedented climate already, glimpses of this kind of unprecedented climate already, is the unprecedented impacts it has. This is a famous World Bank diagram, and I simply pull on it, which tells us very clearly the diminishing capacity that we have to cope, always having to deal with a climate event. The Caribbean emerges, the Caribbean is in red, as the region above all, even above other small island states and other states that has the most damage already, that has the greatest disaster frequency, and that is certainly comparable with the other small island states of an affected population. We have this diminished capacity to cope, not simply because of the intensity of the event, but because of the recurrent nature of climate extremes. But this diminished capacity to cope will not end now. But as we move more and more and transition from unfamiliar to unprecedented, we can see that the cost of climate as we go into the future keeps increasing and increasing and increasing. And certainly by the time we hit the end of century, if we keep doing what we are doing and don't change pathways, a larger percentage of our GDP will be simply spent trying to cope. So, simple point that I'm trying to make. As we take account of climate, there are 2 things we have to note and 3 things to consider. We have to note that a new unfamiliar climate regime is emerging now. And we have to note that an unprecedented climate era is coming. If we note these 2 things, then we have to consider these 3 things. That already our sensitivity is being exposed, that already and to come our vulnerability will be expanding with new climate vulnerable people emerging, and that our viability is already being endangered and is simply at risk in the future. Lastly, if these are the 2 things to note, if these are the 3 things to consider as we take account of climate, then what is the one thing that we must do? I think you know it already. The one thing we have to do is act. A couple of things about this action, and I'll quickly end. The action has to be at all levels. It has to be global, it has to be regional, it has to be national, it has to be community, and it has to be individual. Clearly, the likelihood of action increases as you go towards the center, which puts a huge challenge on me and you, that we cannot simply excuse ourselves and say the responsibility is somebody else, when in fact, it is more likely that we can do something. But the action has to be at all levels, and the Caribbean has to situate itself within all levels. What kind of things am I talking about when I talk about action? Well, we could spend the whole day talking about this. But let me just say that the action has to have a couple of characteristics. One, it has to be a strong mitigation agenda. So mitigation has to be a key part of the action. The truth is the Caribbean put 1.5 degrees on the table as a global target. And you know, the IPCC produced a wonderful report that looked on this. And if 1.5 is to be achieved, then global carbon emissions have to fall by, say, about 45% by 2030. And we have to come down to that net zero mark by mid-century, which means that we really have to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere. The Caribbean, having put 1.5 degrees on the table, in my opinion, cannot excuse itself from the actions and the reduction in greenhouse gases, nor should they want to. For us, that strong mitigation agenda will center around a couple of themes, you know, and these are win-win themes for us. Certainly, they will center around preserving our sinks. We have natural sinks for that carbon dioxide. That's our oceans and that's our forests. And so that's why that mangrove replanting project goes way beyond just the coastal defense that it represents or the livelihoods it represents, but it is also the mitigation, our contribution to mitigation. But it also has to deal with our sources. So what we use for energy, our transportation, and our waste, you know. And so mitigation has to be a part of that action, where we simply reduce the greenhouse gases, because in truth, the areas where we can mitigate are win-win areas for the Caribbean region. But what else? We have to have an unavoidable adaptation agenda. The truth is, if we even achieve 1.5 degrees, and we must hold firm to holding the entire globe to 1.5 degrees, as I have already shown you, 1.5 is in and of itself still not a safe global target for the Caribbean region. And so we will have to adapt. And we want to make sure that the adaptation, and some of it you will hear about in the conference over the next 2 days, those are some of the successes of the PPCR. But, you know, let us make sure that our adaptation has certain characteristics. It must be comprehensive. It can't be in one sector and not in another. It must be contextual. Our adaptation must be driven by our needs and how we define our problems. It must not be adaptation foisted on us. It must be targeted, and that's where research comes in. The adaptation has to be consistent. It has to be consistent with the mitigation goals that we are setting for ourselves with our national determined contributions. And it also has to be compatible with our SDG goals, because not all climate actions will represent synergies with the SDGs. So we have to make sure that there are synergistic for adaptation and recognize the trade-offs. And of course, our adaptation agenda must exploit the opportunities. I think I heard that a little earlier, that climate does come with opportunities to do things differently. And so it must exploit these through the creation of environments for innovation, technology, and certainly entrepreneurship. Very, very quickly. What else must the action have? It must be a sustained education agenda. Education is important for engendering behavioral change, but we must make sure that the education agenda is sustained. It must not be here today and gone tomorrow. And of course, the video that we watched earlier was a beautiful example of using the multimodal opportunities for education. And lastly, that action must be deliberately collaborative. So it must encapsulate a deliberately collaborative agenda. The Caribbean, the challenge that climate change is posing for the Caribbean dwarfs any single Caribbean country. We simply do not have the resources individually to deal with climate. However, we have proved over and over again, and I think that it's emerging even more so with this PPCR. So I use the PPCR project, that a collective approach where you make partners out of everybody, government, private sector, academia, civil society, youth, etc., is the only way that we're going to achieve the resilience. That's the beauty of this PPCR project. So I end, in that context setting, I'm saying, listen, as a Caribbean region, we cannot help but take account of climate. How do we take account of climate? Well, we do this by noting two things, considering three things, and doing one thing. We have to know that a new unfamiliar climate regime is approaching. We have to know that an unprecedented climate era is to come. We have to consider that our sensitivity is being exposed, our vulnerabilities are being expanding, and our viability is being endangered. And then we have to do one thing, we have to act. Strong mitigation, unavoidable adaptation, sustained education, and deliberate collaboration. And so this is the last word that I say. If you forget everything I talked about, the 2-3-1 of climate, 2 things to know, 3 things to consider, and 1 thing to do, remember that this conference is about visioning a pathway to a climate resilient future. You know what that pathway is marked by? Recognizing climate, reckoning with climate, and responding to climate. That's our pathway. Thank you very much.